Welcome everybody to an afternoon session to talk about death and dying and veterans. And it's certainly a difficult topic and one that we're going to handle as respectfully as we can. And my name is Christina Davis. As she says, I work at the Hershey Woody Williams VA in Huntington, West Virginia. I'm a hospice and palliative care coordinator here. I've worked here at the Huntington VA, and I'm going to have to ignore that whole thing. Um, I've worked here at the Huntington VA for 5 years. And prior to that, as I was saying before everyone got on, I worked at a local hospice for about 14. So, one of the things we want to talk about today is really our veterans from all eras. And we're going to talk about their experiences, what some of the things they experienced as they served our country, and how that impacts them as they're on their journey. And the first thing that I want to say, I want to give a little disclaimer here. So, in order to learn about some of the issues that our veterans are having, we really have to go back and talk about some of the experiences they had at wartime, and we need to talk about what was going on in our country and their culture, so to put into perspective their experiences. So, a little bit of this is going to feel like a history lesson, and and if you live through these times and eras, some of what I say you're going to remember. Some of what I say you may have a different perspective or memory. Because certainly when we talk about war and conflicts, it stimulates within us emotion. And particularly if you are a family member of a serviceman or servicewoman, you are going to, some of what I say is going to resonate with you, and some of what I say will be, oh, that wasn't that person's experience at all. And that's okay. We're going to talk about generalities today. And of course, the bottom line is we always know. Could you respond to that? No, don't respond to that. Could you go tell Marie that I'm on a call, please? Um, I think what we're going to do is in generalities here, it's still our responsibility as a social worker, as always, to do an independent assessment. That we're going to start where the veteran is and go from there in their individual experiences. So we're going to get into that. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is if you are a veteran, thank you for your service. If you're the wife of a veteran, thank you for being married to a wife of a veteran. That too can be a challenge. And I think if we go through, if I asked you, everyone, to kind of look at their own family system and say, who in your mind do you know that is a veteran? Was it your grandfather, your grandmother, your mother, your father? Do you have a son and daughter in service time? I believe that that will apply to most of us. We'll have someone in our family system, and it may be the next of kin that has served our country. So hopefully this will help open up a dialogue for you and some insight to some of their service time, but it also brings to light what a special population that veterans are. And it's often not recognized when you talk to, I guess, in the social work class, when you talk to uh, our regular agencies, we certainly recognize certain groups of people, and social work as a special population. And I think over the last 5 years, it's really come to fruition and acknowledgement that veterans are a special population as well, sometimes within special populations. So we're going to talk about that today. And the first thing in the first slide you see, I quoted this famous little speech here that says, all gave some and some gave all. So we're going to talk a lot about combat veterans. We're going to talk about peacetime veterans. The point here is that if anybody has served in the military, they have elected to give something of themselves, whether they were combat or not, whether they were sent overseas or whether they're serving at home. They made a sacrifice. They've left their family for a time. They put maybe careers and dreams on hold. So even if they may not have been wounded on the battlefield, and we're going to talk more about that today and how sometimes that impacts whether someone will even claim if they're a veteran or not, we want to honor that and always be mindful. Today we're going to do, we want to learn how to assess for military service. and how this has an impact on our dying veterans, how this may impact no matter what field you are in social work. You need to know if the person that you're serving is a veteran. We're going to talk about how they can benefit from early conversations and clarifying wishes regarding life-sustaining treatments and what actually may also drive their decisions in that. And we hope that you'll be able at the end of today to verbalize some specific issues and concerns to make you more aware of end-of-life issues for veterans, and also the importance and value of linking veterans to services. So let's talk about who we're talking about. So right now we have about 19 million living veterans. About 9% of those are women. And in the state of West Virginia, we have about almost 148,000 veterans, and almost 10,000 of those are women. 75% of the veterans in our state are over 75 years old. So we're definitely dealing typically with an older population, and with, I think, some diversity as well. It doesn't sound like a big number, but I have a feeling that we will all know someone or have served someone who is a veteran. So let's break that down now by war era. So we only have, and this is national numbers, we only have about 326,000 World War II veterans left. About 1 million from the Korea conflict, 6 million from the Vietnam era, and about 8 million from the Gulf War era till today. So it's really important that if you are privileged to see a World War II veteran, to shake that hand if you can, but not in the land of COVID, I guess, but consider that you're standing in front of history, because certainly my children's children will only get to read about World War II veterans in history books, because we're losing on average of about 400 a day, because they're just an old, aging population. So it's a special opportunity when you get to serve a World War II veteran. So the other thing we know is about 25% of all deaths that happen every day in the United States are veterans. So you got to think about that. 1 out of every 4 people who will die today will be a veteran. More than 1,800 die every day. And the interesting thing, and why this is so important, this talk, is that we only care for, at the VA, a small percentage, less than 4% of veterans are going to die receiving VA services and benefits. 96% are going to receive their care out in the community from community providers like you. So only 49% of all veterans are enrolled to receive any type of benefit. So that also includes financial services, not just health care. One of the things that I hope that you do today is let's talk about how to even ask a veteran if they're a veteran. And what I don't want you to do is ask a veteran, are you a veteran? And the reason is there's a certain group of military folks who won't acknowledge or identify themselves as veterans. They may not even realize they are. A better way to say it is to tell me about your military experience. Have you had any military experience? So for example, if you were a nurse in World War II, you may not recognize yourself as a veteran, but yet you are. And yet you're eligible for VA benefits and services, but may have spent your whole life not claiming or standing up when veterans were recognized. Oh, I don't know what that was. So certain other groups, such as National Guard, Guardsmen may not always recognize themselves as veterans. I don't know that everybody's muted. So certain groups, such as National Guardsmen, sometimes don't always recognize themselves. I think the younger generation are more likely to do that, but others, particularly the older generation who are Guardsmen, sometimes won't stand. Sometimes Coast Guard won't stand, even though they are, and special groups. So it's really important, because a lot of people think that the word veteran means combat, and so that's not necessarily the case. So questions that you want to know, and I encourage you to integrate in any assessment, no matter what you do as a social worker, is then to ask when and where did you serve, And what did you do while you were in the service? And the reason why we're going to want you to ask these questions is because it may influence both their physical health, their mental health, and their quality of life, and their family system. And I don't know many areas in social work where we're not dealing with family systems and mental health on some level, particularly when we're even just trying to engage for resources and services. So what you see here on the screen is just a suggestion of it's called a military history checklist. And this is kind of some ideas of in which branch of the military did you serve, in which era or period of service did you serve, so that you can get an idea of when that was. And then how do they view their military experience? Some people, when you ask that question, you're going to get an earful that it was horrible. And other times you're going to get an earful of it was the best days of my life. And this is what it did for me. And I saw the world. And I've had World War II veterans say it's the first time I had new shoes. It's the first time I had electricity. And others are going to tell you, particularly maybe if they were drafted, I can't believe I had to do that. So it's really important because we need to take our cues from the veteran about what they want to talk about. So if that's a positive experience or negative, you're going to know. And then particularly when we were dealing with hospice, we always asked, would you like to have a hospice staff member or a volunteer to talk more about your service? But the other thing that you can do with this is to ask them, do they get services at the VA? And if the answer to that is no, you can ask permission to link them to the VA for services. So I want to start here. We're going to start with the World War II veterans. And again, this is going to feel like a little bit of a history lesson, and it's so important. It will tie all in at the end. So hang with me here, okay? So we know that on December 7th, 1941, we know that that was when Pearl Harbor was attacked and we declared war. And so there's an official start date. That's something to know. And we also had a known enemy here. So in World War II, it went from 1941 to December 31 of 1946. And there were more than 16 million who served. Just think about that, 16 million who served in the armed forces during World War II. We lost 291,000 to battle deaths. We had more than 670,000 battle wounded. There were 433 medals of honor that came out of that time. And one of the questions you want to know about World War II, so just depending on what you know, might depend on the mental image that you're having about what World War II looks like. I mean, it was a world war, so they could have been in Pacific, they could have been in Asia, and they could have been in Europe. So all of those veterans are experiencing, at the same time, different environments, different weather patterns, just completely different experiences. So we had fighting on Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Atlantic, the Pacific Oceans. And service was carried out in severe weather conditions, winter, the harshest of hot deserts, in tropical climates. So when you go to talk to a World War II veteran, it's important that you know, well, gosh, where did you serve? Because that's going to be a whole different experience. And the other thing back then is joining up or being drafted meant that you were in the military for the duration. Like, it really wasn't that you were in the middle of a war and all of a sudden your time's up and you come home. You're in till you're in, till either you're wounded and you come home or it's over. So it was a long time of service. And we had known enemies. Like, there was no question who we were fighting. It was the Allies versus Axis. It was Germany, Italy, and Japan with their identified leaders versus us with USA and Russia and France and England all aligning together. So we were a united team. It was good versus evil. It was all kinds of people phrased it differently, but it was well known what we were in this thing for. So the other thing that I just want to say about that time is that's very important. And you're going to see that here is as not only veterans integrate and talk about their military experience and what they did and what they were asked to do, it's important if they understood what they were fighting for. And it's also important because it matters what society supports you for back home, you know, if everybody's in it with you. So it's important to note too that there's some unique health risks for veterans with every era, and we're going to talk about that. So infectious diseases such as TB, malaria, frequent wounds, frostbite, and cold injury. There was mustard gas testing, exposure to nuclear weapons, there's nuclear cleanup. There's all kinds of things that kind of happened in World War II that our veterans were exposed to. So the other thing that's really interesting about World War II is it was a whole national movement. You had people back home that were growing victory gardens to help feed the troops and feed themselves so that the government could send all these resources back over to the troops. There were all kinds of efforts that were made to ensure that, you know, women went without pantyhose and women went to work, and it was a united front. And you'll see posters that says loose lips sink ships. I mean, we even thought over here on this side of the country that we couldn't even talk about certain war issues because we might contribute to what was happening on the battlefront. It was a nation united to serve our guys and to help our military win. It was an all-team effort that we have rarely seen at the level of what that was. Young men were lying about their age to enlist. I met a gentleman who was 15 who lied about his age to get so he could go into service. I had another Navy man, he turned 17 on the ship, headed over. It was the thing to do. To if you were patriotic, this is what you did. And actually, at times you were shamed if you didn't. I mean, it was just culturally well supported. The image that you see here is the flagpole at the base there in Hawaii that was attacked there on 1941, and then this picture shows it today in 2007. So it was certainly a horrible day, and it started us on a big journey as a country. And thankfully, you can see now that our flag still flies and it's all whole now that it's flying over that base. So the World War II veterans had a very distinct experience, for sure. So then that leaves us to the arms race and the Cold War. And this is our generation, right? We here, and many of us lived through this. And I certainly, once I was doing the research for this project, I remembered so much of some of the culture that I experienced as a young girl, because out of the World War II, we entered the Cold War era, and where once Russia was our ally, all of a sudden became not necessarily our ally, and we had all this tension between the US and its allies and the Soviet bloc. And it started in 1945, and really it completed until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. I mean, we can all remember, I'm sure on this call, when the wall came down. And you may remember the big arms race where we were trying to get our military built back up and into space first before Russia did. And if you had a conversation around your dinner table, probably as a young person or this era, you were probably talking about, you know, someday we're probably going to war with Russia. I mean, it was a big cultural event. And we had a lot of concerns and fear of a nuclear war. I mean, if you think about it, it was a pretty common experience in which we were afraid they were going to bomb us, and they were afraid we were going to bomb them. And then we got into the big space issue and satellites and who could get there first. So there was also fear of health concerns if we got exposed to radiation. I mean, there were sometimes drills at schools about what if the bomb was sent our way, what would the children do? People built, I have a neighbor that built a war bunker so that if we went into an atomic war, they had a place to go hide. So there's a lot of layers to this that impacted many people in their culture growing up. But it also impacted our service personnel. So approximately 200,000 U.S. service personnel performed occupational duties So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, following the atomic bombing of Japan, and similar numbers of service members participated in nuclear weapons testing from 45 to 62. So, you know, those are things that we really, that doesn't really make the news of the number of exposures to radiation. So many atomic veterans, while they weren't known to be on the front line battle like our World War II veterans, were doing things all the time that was impacting their health and their experiences. And they lived in a different kind of fear with different kinds of responsibilities. So many atomic veterans had exposure to radiation and may develop leukemia and cancers and cataracts and have whatever comes with nuclear testing and cleanup. So other things, just to show you some of the projects that they had to do during this era time. So there was certainly mustard gas and military tests that happened in the 40s. And certainly we'll talk more about Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam, and those pre-tests happened. There were military tests of chemical and biological warfare materials that took place from the 60s to the 70s. And you can see here a huge list of different issues. And Camp Lejeune is one that is often in the news now because there was some contaminated drinking water from 53 to 87. That just being on that base at Camp Lejeune exposed our military to different health exposures that now has impacted their life later in life and caused some diseases and things that they have to deal with. So here's a picture of actual some testing, and I look at this picture and I think about, well, there's something to be said for that, because there had to be somebody on that beach taking those pictures and taking all of those air tests and all of the things that happen when they were testing something like that. And I actually talked to a veteran who said there was a sign at his base that said, hey, if you want extra duty pay, sign up here. So he didn't have anything to do that weekend. So he signed up and got on a bus, and they took him out to a place that looked a lot like this. And the next thing he knows, he was on a ship, and he was on the board of the ship, and he was given some glasses, and they said, okay, just stand here and watch this. So he stood there and he watched something like this occur, exposed to goodness knows what at that time. And after it was over, they brought him back and completed some health assessments and some interviews and those things, but he had no idea what he was signing up for. He just wanted some extra money that weekend and didn't have anything else to do. So there's some interesting stories from our veterans about this time. So because of this and other exposures, every VA medical facility has a registry for it's for Agent Orange, the Gulf War, and ionizing radiation. So basically, if a veteran experienced these things during service time, they register so that as other health information and knowledge becomes available caused by their exposure, they're on a regular list where they can receive information, health testing is needed, and every VA is required to have one. So let's talk a little bit about the Korean conflict. And we always say the Korean War, but technically it was never a war. It's considered a conflict technically. And also what Korean veterans are going to tell you is the Forgotten War. So, and that occurred from June 25th of 50 to July 27th of 53. So it was a 3-year war, and it was a bloody war. And it was embattled with lots of issues. We had more than 5 million people serve. We had more than 33,000 battle deaths. We had more than 103,000 wounded, 131 medals of honor. But they experienced something that was really over the top, and that was they had severe cold injury, severe exposure to a very harsh winter with sub-zero weather, and not the best outfitted military. Like, they just had regular boots. They didn't have the 1,000 grams of insulation we have on our boots now. They had regular boots. They didn't have the level of winter gear that we send in now. They were making do. Um, and they also had some unique experiences that if you're talking to a Korean War veteran, you need to be aware of. So cold injuries, including frostbite and immersion and trench foot, constituted a major problem for us. So not only were we worried about, we were dealing with battle issues, we had over 5,000 U.S. casualties because of cold injury. I mean, think about that. So 16% of all of our non-battle injuries were cold injury. It was a huge issue. So Korean War veterans also deal with things like peripheral neuropathy, which is pain in your feet, nerve damage, skin cancers caused by the frostbite on their heels and their earlobes. Arthritis is often a common thing. Chronic athlete's foot, chronic feet issues, sometimes nocturnal pain, and cold sensations. All of these things you could be sitting across from a veteran of this era and you think it's just common, but maybe not. It may be linked to their service time. And it is the case that during this time, what they're experiencing may get worse as they age. So we know that arthritis and peripheral vascular disease, those things are progressive. And it does make them at higher risk for things like amputations and other complications that older veterans may be experiencing now because of the service time when they're a young man or woman. So I thought this was an interesting quote. We came home and nobody noticed that we were gone. And a lot of Korean conflict veterans will say that. You know, they lived at the time when their fathers, and some of them, their fathers, their brothers, their uncles went to World War II. And what did they have? They had support. They had people raising gardens. They had people doing all kinds of things. And when we got to the Korean conflict, culture wasn't that way now. And it wasn't a whole world effort. And the reason that we're there was a little bit confusing to the population. So interesting enough, only 10% of people had televisions when this conflict started. But by the end, in those 3 years, that went to 40%. So the whole influence of media just started to influence in that time frame. Before that, it was limited to print, what the newspapers had to say. It wasn't like it is today where we can pull up CNN News or on our iPhone and video chat, even with the military service personnel that are overseas. So often they came home to silence. There wasn't and we'll talk more about this, when a World War II veterans came home, they came home in a group together. It was a big party. There was ticker tape parades. It was we won. It was this big thing. And then when they came home, it was often silence. There wasn't a party. There wasn't a lot of people at the dock. It might have just been their family. And even then, because victory wasn't as clear as it was in World War II, people didn't talk about it. And for the first time from World War II, there was actually an opinion, a difference of opinion in society, in our country, that maybe we shouldn't be over there, and a negative connotation for our military folks sometimes, that had never happened before. So often they did come home in silence and they didn't really talk about it. And particularly if you sat at a table, like if they were sitting at a table with their dad who was in World War II, or they were sitting at the table with their uncle or a church member, they didn't quite have the same stories and fanciful events that made all of the news just a few years prior. So the other thing that happened in this conflict that's important that we're going to talk about is that it was more like a truce. It was an armistice that was signed. So in World War II, we had a clear victory. We had we won. I had a World War II veteran said we kicked Hitler's butt, but he didn't say but, of course. Just a proud response. And then here we thought we come off of World War II as kind of big and bad, and you can't beat us. And then we go over to this 3-year conflict, and we walk out of there with a truce. And so that was not popular in our society. And it also, I think, led to that silence. Like, we didn't feel like we had anything to celebrate, even though, because we held the line, but we ended up kind of started where we finished, and we finished where we started. So it created a difference. And so for the longest time, even these group of veterans were not even allowed in the VFW because it wasn't a declared war at the time. So it took time after that for that to happen. So they didn't even have the same level of support from the veterans organizations as other soldiers did who came home from World War II. So now we're going to spend some time on the Vietnam War, and we're going to talk a lot about this because it's so important. So Richard Nixon said, "No event in American history is more misunderstood than the Vietnam War. It was misreported then, and it is misremembered now." And I think that's a pretty profound statement, because if you talk to any Vietnam veteran, their experience was very individual. And it was very difficult, and it was like nothing we had ever done before. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that was. And I'm just going to ask you to keep bearing with me here as we get through this historical part. So those who have fought for freedom and have lost it know a sadness and a sense of loss beyond bearing. Let me see if this is, so I want to do this one. So we know this was from 64 to 75, 8 million total who served in all of the armed services. We had more than 47,000 battle deaths. We had other deaths, almost 11,000 that happened in theater. We had 154,000 wounded and 238 medals of honor. And they had lengthened time of service is a health risk for them, and exposure to Agent Orange and infectious diseases we'll talk more about. But this is the one, this became the first war that really is recognized as still killing people today, that we're still losing veterans from medical conditions that they developed because of their service time. So when we talk about how many people we lost in Vietnam, what you see on this screen is a scratch in the surface, because every day we lose Vietnam veterans due to diseases that were caused by their service time and their exposure to Agent Orange. So when we look at the Vietnam War, we know that there was a lack of unit cohesiveness. I said to you before that World War II, your unit you left together, you came home together. You often came home on a boat with a bunch of guys on there, and you had a 10 to 14 day journey where you could kind of talk about what you experienced. You had some support. You had people surrounding you that had been through what you had been through, and they know where you've been. And you also had this mission that was supported by your country. So many veterans were sent to Vietnam as individuals. Like, you were drafted and you were sent and dropped off at the helicopter wherever you were sent to be stationed. And when your time was up, you were picked up and you were brought home as an individual. You didn't necessarily come back with buddies. You didn't go with buddies. You often left when your tour of duty was completed. So no matter how you felt about that, when your time was up, you could re-enlist, but it wasn't like it was in World War II, which you could be there for a while. You were going to serve this time. The problem with that is when you are rotating troops out all of the time, then you're rotating green troops out all of the time. Just as your troops are getting seasoned and used to those conditions, you're pulling them out and putting someone new in their place to start all over. So we certainly had a lot of friendly fire incidents over there. And of course it was stressful, and that was also contributing. And we also, for the first time, was in kind of a guerrilla warfare. We no longer had the line. Like in Korea, we had a line and we were moving, and it was us versus them. And Here it was blurred, and it could be a child that you were walking up to on the side of the road that you thought you were going to help. You could go to a dead body to try to help or get that person home, and there could be a bomb put on that deceased body. You had all this jungle, and you couldn't see. It wasn't clear, and you didn't ever know if you were very safe. And when you're experiencing that, it takes a toll emotionally and psychologically. It just can make a huge difference when you're in an environment and you don't know what's behind you, what's in front of you. And when you hear gunfire, you don't know if it's friendly. And then you're surrounded by people who are new and unsure of themselves too. It's an unsettling feeling. So one of the other things, and I'm just going to let that sit there for a minute. One of the other things that Vietnam veterans experienced was, so now we have more media involved. Everybody had a TV. We had reporters for the first time. We were really seeing some gruesome pictures sometimes, and we had now an opinion. We're in the 60s, we're in peace and love, and we have some anti-war movements. We've never had a true anti-war movement in our country until Vietnam. Before then, hey, in World War II, remember, we're unified. I'm going to keep reminding you that we're unified. In Korea, we're kind of unified, but we're really not even going to talk about it. And then we get to Vietnam, and now we're split. And everyone's individual responses when they came back. And there are some significant stories, and I'm sure if you spent some time with some veterans, they will share them with you of what they experienced when they got off the plane at the airport. I mean, there are some people who changed their uniform in the bathroom because they didn't want to wear it out because they were going to get negative feedback, sometimes spit at or called baby killers. So all of those things are now different for our soldiers, and they hadn't experienced that before. But when we talk about Vietnam War and environmental hazards, we want to look at, they were in high temperatures, high humidity. It was like a monsoon. It rained for days. Few opportunities for bathing. They were just wet, poor skin hygiene. They suffered from bacterial and fungal infections, and that also attributed to skin disease. And then they were exposed to Agent Orange. Now, Agent Orange, the intent of Agent Orange was to help, because they were in such brush, and I had a veteran explain to me that the brush was just in front of his, it was nothing that we experience here. It was so dense you couldn't see in front of your face. So at the time, it sounded like a great idea to put this herbicide that would knock down the brush. And particularly if you were the soldier, then you couldn't know behind you or beside of you, and you couldn't see, and you knew the enemy was out there somewhere. You were thankful when they sprayed that brush killer in order to get that brush down and you could see on some level. So the intent was that it was supposed to be helpful and to expose the enemy, and it would help protect our troops. It didn't have, and it may have helped for the moment, but unfortunately we exposed all of our troops to cancer-causing agent that also impacts heart and lungs, and we had a horrible probably long-term outcome because of something we were doing in order to be helpful, if that makes sense. So one of the things I get asked a lot is, well, how do we know if they were exposed to Agent Orange? Like, there's no test. How we look at that is we look at that veterans, what we call DD-214, which is their discharge paper from their service time. And we know where they were stationed because we know where Agent Orange was utilized for the most part, and we try to correlate that with their service time, and then that's how we know and can show, yes, they were exposed to Agent Orange. And same thing with Navy, if they were in what we call black water, which is they were close enough for that to have been exposed, for them to be exposed by air and wind, then they can also have had a positive exposure and not know it, even though they weren't boots on the ground. And we ask that a lot of times of service men and women, were you boots on the ground in Vietnam? So the thing that VA does is, if we know if your boot touched the ground in Vietnam for 1 minute, and we can show that that happened by your service record, or your ship is known to have been in what we call black water, then we presume that you had Agent Orange exposure. We're just going to make that assumption. So once we prove and show, when we make that assumption for you that you've had Agent Orange exposure, then the VA is now required by law to provide hospital care and medical services to a veteran if we can show that they were Agent Orange exposed. So here's some of the other fallout that happened because of Agent Orange. So malignant diseases such as lung cancer, prostate, Hodgkin's, skin cancers, myeloma, and non-malignant diseases such as spina bifida, birth defects, diabetes, peripheral neuropathy, and there's also like heart disease. So basically, if we know that a veteran was exposed to Agent Orange and they develop any of these diseases, then the VA assumes and presumes responsibility that it was linked to Agent Orange. So I'll give you an example. So lung cancer, for example, you may be a veteran who smoked all your life and developed lung cancer, or you may have come back and been a coal miner. You may have had all kinds of other exposures that cause your lung cancer. But if we show that you were in Vietnam, whether you have all those factors or not, we are going to presume that it's related to your service time, and that makes that person eligible for certain additional benefits and services. So the other thing that was pretty prevalent and is widespread in the Vietnam population was the hepatitis C virus. So 63% of rural veterans tested positive for HCV were Vietnam veterans. So it's high in that population for that group. And it's important that we identify that and treat that, because that can also lead to liver cancers and those things, and get them treatment. So I want to talk a little bit, we're going to switch gears from that, and I promise at the end we're going to tie all this together. So just bear with me. So we're going to talk about the Gulf War, which is 90 to 91. And you'll remember Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield, and we deployed 700,000. We had about 383 fatalities. There was aerial and ground combat, and it was basically in Iraq, Kuwait, and areas of Saudi Arabia. So it marked the introduction of live new coverage from the front lines, right? If you remember, many of us watched this on the news. Like, you would look at your tune in at Channel 3 at 6, and they would have live coverage of us sending bombs over and them exploding. And it was pretty just commonplace that you could have watched actually live the war and the battlefield, and to see what was going on. And then we come to 9/11, the day we will never forget, right? So when you look back at the Gulf War, there was mixed popularity, about that in the United States. Some were for, some were against, some didn't know why we were there. There's just a lot of mixed population opinions, just like it was in the Korean War and for the Vietnam War, for that matter. But it was kind of it became part of our daily life to watch that. And then we had 9/11, the day we will never forget. And then, if you remember, we got a whole new level of support back for our troops, right? After 9/11, it became more of accepted in our country that we were going to strike back, that nobody was going to do that to us, and how dare they? And I remember we were putting yellow ribbons on trees, and we were wearing yellow pins, and you had yellow ribbon t-shirts and the bumper stickers. For those of you who are old enough like me to remember these things, it became a national plan to support our troops again. So we know then and now, so post 9/11, so from post 9/11 '01 to now. What are we doing, right? We've had war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and when you see OEF, that's Operation Enduring Freedom. These are the names of the missions that we did. OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation New Dawn was declared by Obama, and now we say we're in the global war on terror. So since then to now, 8 million have served since the Gulf War. 7,000 U.S. troops have been killed, and that was just through 2018. I don't have an updated number since then. More than 52,000 wounded. I thought it was interesting the number of private contractors that the United States has used that have also died. And unfortunately, 78,000 veterans have died of suicide since 2005. And the other thing that's interesting is this is an all volunteer source. We're not doing drafting. So that has led to multiple deployments. You will meet a 9/11, post 9/11 veteran, and they might tell you, hey, I've been to Iraq 3 times. I've been to Afghanistan 2 or 3 times. They come home, we pull them back. And that's also a different experience than any other service area that we've had before. So let's talk about some of the physical problems that some of our post-Gulf War are experiencing. One is fatigue and memory loss and confusion, the ability to concentrate, some generic, not specific type of symptoms, muscle pain, joint pain. We know also that they demonstrated poor performance on cognitive tests. Then those other Gulf War veterans who didn't report these same symptoms. So the outcomes for that group of veterans are primarily based on self-reports. And they did not ever identify this unique syndrome or unique illness. They recognize a high percentage of consistent reports of issues such as fatigue, multiple chemical sensitivities, fibromyalgia, just chronic fatigue. Deployment placed veterans at increased risk for symptoms of psychiatric illnesses, and we know that this group of veterans suffer from high incidences of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. Not that we didn't have that from the Vietnam War or even the Korean or even World War II. They called PTSD shell shock. But in this generation, we see a lot of PTSD and these other issues. They also have been exposed to infectious diseases and respiratory issues, being on the burning oil fields, exposure to sewage, agricultural and industrial contamination of water, air pollution, severe sand and dust storms, depleted uranium. You know, when you watch and you read about what our soldiers go through when they're just out there and you hear this 2-minute news blip, you don't hear about these things. You don't hear about the specific issues that our veterans are experiencing and what they're being exposed to. The other issue that's been huge for this era is certainly the blunt trauma, and burn injuries, blast injuries, and traumatic brain injuries have been significant. Spinal cord injury. You know, when you're just driving down a road on your duty and it looks like a normal road, and you end up, your truck hits an IED and you blow up, that has long-lasting effects. Certainly some infections that are resistant to drugs, we've seen that, and again, mental health issues. So why do we talk about all these? Why are we talking about all these specific health risks for these veterans? Well, when we talk about end of life, and when you're interviewing someone at end of life, you need to understand what they've been exposed to. And that also can lead to a conversation, particularly if they're linked for the VA, of services and benefits they might be eligible for. And many veterans, they don't know. I mean, I still meet veterans today and every day that may have a new diagnosis of lung cancer who served boots on the ground in Vietnam, and they've never put the 2 to 2 together yet. And so that is why the VA has something that we call disability compensation. So based on a veteran's disease, they're giving a rating. We call it a service connection from 0 to 100%. So 100% really saying that it's like a total disability. And based on the amount of their percentage, it determines how much money that the VA will pay this veteran for the rest of their life to deal and cope with this illness. So for example, if you had lung cancer, you became terminal, you were Agent Orange exposed, you're going to get a 100% service connected rating. And then not only does that give you income to also help pay for your care that you're going to be needing, but it also makes your widow, your survivor, eligible for widow's pension, because she can also then draw a portion of your benefits for the rest of her life. Because if you die from a service-connected disability, then the government feels also a responsibility to help take care of the survivor that lost their spouse earlier in life because of their service time. So it's important that we help veterans identify these things so we can link them to all of the resources they're eligible for, because it not only impacts them, it impacts their family. And that can impact for generations. There's also something called VA pension. So let's say that you are a veteran, but you weren't hurt, you weren't exposed to Agent Orange, and you can't link anything that's wrong with you to a service time injury or disease. Then there's something called pension that's needs-based, and that's based on financial. Just basically, if you're a veteran below poverty and you served during a wartime, then you may be eligible to receive some money to bring you up closer to the poverty line. So that it's kind of like the VA version is like Social Security type of, that we want to make sure that they have some type of income. Their widow would also be eligible if they were connected with that, if they need be. So that's just one reason that when it's really important for the community, and remember, 96% of people are going to die without services at the VA, but they could be receiving some financial compensation, much less the medical health care that we're going to talk about more, if they know what to ask for. So if you are an informed person, an informed social worker in front of them, you can help screen for some of these things and link them and tell them about some resources. So let's tie all this together. What does all this mean at end of life? So I thought this was a beautiful quote. The outcome of any armed conflict holds not just the promise of peace, but also dark, terrible revelations, questions of justice over the vanquished, and for far too many, the confronting of personal loss. Basically, you're not going to go through any of the things that I've discussed with you and not come back as a changed person. So remember, I talked to you earlier about the wonderful homecoming that World War II folks came home to, and this is a picture of a ticker tape parade. By the way, Korean conflict veterans did not come home to a ticker tape parade. They didn't get one. But so here it is. It's this big party. It's well celebrated. It's attended by thousands. It's a huge deal. It was a time when you soldiers wanted to wear their uniform, right? They were going to put that on for every opportunity that they could, because when they walked down the street, they were going to get a positive acknowledgement. And even though many of them may still have been shell-shocked, what we call today PTSD, they may have seen and done things that morally for them was a challenge, they were able to integrate that into their life as for the greater good, and that it was well supported, and this is what I had to do, and God understands what I had to do, and I was a good soldier, and I followed orders, and I'm a hero now. So often when Vietnam veterans came home, I mentioned this earlier too, they came home to this. This was not a ticker tape parade. There wasn't beautiful women waiting to kiss strangers as they come off the boat. There wasn't big parties, and you certainly were not necessarily held as a hero when you came back. And you can imagine you've been um, drafted and maybe forced to serve in a war you may or may not have supported, and you ended up having to do things that did not feel good to you, and your family may not have been in agreement that you should be over there. And then you do your duty, and then you come back to the social isolation and a negative culture that has completely changed. And many of them will say, I left and America was one way, and we came back and it's not, doesn't even seem like the same place. I feel like an alien. So when you talk about, I'd like for you to visualize, if you talk about, I'm going to give you an example. So imagine if you were just a patient that you had, let's say you have a patient who has lung cancer, and they're in a community hospital, and that, and then you have a veteran and they have lung cancer. Can you imagine some of the differences of what that might be? You may have the same diagnosis, but your thoughts and feelings about that lung cancer could be very different. You might be burning mad, particularly if you were drafted. Your family might very well cope with this diagnosis of lung cancer very differently. They might be angry. They might be really struggling with all that they've experienced and lived through. Let's say you're the wife of someone who has PTSD, and you have lived and watched them suffer and have horrible nightmares, maybe had to walk on eggshells yourself at times, make sure you don't startle them. All of the things that even the families of veterans who struggle with issues go through. So you have the same diagnosis. So this is a very different experience and a very different integration of what that diagnosis is. And so that also forms and shapes their journey for the rest of their life, some things that they might have to work through. And so I really think that when we get to Erickson's theory and we talk about integrity versus despair, so let's think about this for a minute. When you get to the end of your life, you're going to look back at your life and you're going to either say one of two things. You're going to say, it was a good life. I played the cards that I was dealt well. I've had a good experience. I love my family. I did the best I could. I provided for my family. There were ups and downs, but overall, it's been good. Or you're going to look back at your life and you're going to think about despair. And you're going to think about, goodness, I didn't get a good hand dealt with me. I had to go and fight in a foreign country, and I'm not even sure I know why I was there. I had to do things I don't approve of. I may have had to kill civilians. I may have had to even watch children mortality. I've had to watch my buddies die on the battlefield, and I'm still not sure why they died. I've had to live with nightmares. And because of all that I experienced, I came back not right. And I wasn't the best husband that I could have been. I wasn't the best father I could have been. I may have self-medicated a little bit with alcohol or drugs. Or I may have isolated myself from my family and just kind of got a camper and went across country. And I don't have significant relationships with my family anymore. So you're on two opposite ends of the spectrum, and some people are in the middle. They have both. So really, when we talk about end of life, we have to help veterans process wherever they are. And if you have someone who's working with despair, then we really have to work hard to help them move through to come to a place of understanding and acceptance that, you know, they did the best they could with what they had. And hindsight is always 2020, and that's easy for me to say. But a lot of times, if you have someone who is served in the military, there may be a level of despair that we have to help them work through. And this is also an instance, a part of life that can follow them their entire life. So if you look at this guy, he was a World War II veteran, loud and proud. He has probably kept that uniform, I don't know, probably 60 years, 70 years. He's going to show up at every event. When he looks back at his service, it was really a post-traumatic growth system for him. It helped him relate to others, particularly when you talk to West Virginians and Kentuckians that were rural, and they talk about the experience that they've had in the military. They'll tell you they saw the world. That it was maybe they didn't have a lot of food, they didn't have a lot of resources to share, and for the first time they had 3 square meals. They became open to new possibilities. It gave them personal strength. They learned skills and got maybe their GED and some education. They had a new appreciation of life. And when they found themselves in tough times, for some, it helped them grow spiritually. It became a good, positive experience. So some patients, some veterans have learned to integrate these difficult experiences in their life. They're naturally resilient. They have good family support. They probably had somebody writing them a letter every day that they were gone, and they had a positive war outcome. They beat the enemy, and they had the opportunity to talk about their war experiences. People wanted to hear their stories, and they were able to tell them, maybe embellish them, and feel like a hero. And for many of those patients, I would just want to tell you that some of them will tell you it was the best time of their life, that they look at that as that experience gave them their chance to build a better life. So then when you come to post-traumatic stress disorder, well, that's different. And it could be the same good person experiencing maybe even the same thing on a different level. They may be exposed to the same traumatic event, but come out of that with different experiences and different perceptions about what they had to do. So certainly we know that those who suffer from PTSD they keep re-experiencing this negative, these nightmares, these recollections, these flashbacks, sometimes sensory distress cues. You'll read about it every 4th of July, about how difficult that fireworks is on veterans who have PTSD. You know, what sounds to us like a celebration, that is not a celebration to someone who has that. That is usually an event in which they're trying to isolate at home and do something different to try to downplay that noise. And the individual sometimes avoids those associated traumatic stimuli, thoughts and feelings and conversations about trauma. You'll have that veteran, like I told you earlier, that will say, I'm not going to talk about that, and I don't want to talk about that. I had a veteran tell me that today. I'm leaving the past in the past. I'm not digging up my old bones. That's what he said. So thoughts and feelings about that and situations that trigger those cues. If you are with someone who has PTSD and you're their wife, you're going to probably learn how to sit in a restaurant where his back is not to the door. He's going to want to look out that door and see that. You'll also notice, and if you're in an elevator with someone who has PTSD, their take on that isn't, they really don't like that. They might avoid that and take the stairs. And for every other person, their symptoms and their triggers are different. But it is life-changing, and not only to that of the veteran, but to the family. A friend of mine, her husband has PTSD, and she said, I didn't realize how much that impacted us until I found myself at the mall looking for exits. And then I looked at my teenage daughter, and she was looking for exits, and she was automatically sitting in a certain position so that her back wouldn't be to the door. So they naturally ingrained this behavior that they learned from him, and it has impacted their lives in ways that they don't even recognize sometimes. So we know that PTSD can be acute and chronic. It can be delayed. I mean, it could be several years when all of a sudden this raises its ugly head. So how it will manifest and who it affects is unpredictable. Like, there's no test. The military doesn't have a test that says, oh, you're going to go to the battlefield and not have this issue, and you will. There's no way to know that. We know that immediate treatment when this comes up and ongoing support is helpful, and it makes a difference in learning to live and address these issues. Unfortunately, these traumatic combat memories can cause and has caused for some alcohol and drug abuse in order to self-medicate, some social isolation, I referenced that earlier, anxieties, anger outbursts, difficulty concentrating and functioning. Guilt and shame is also a big factor for veterans. So they could really experience some guilt at the end of their life for having taken someone else's life in the course of their duty, for not ever being able to save their buddy and watching that person die on the battlefield. Just having that survivor's guilt of why he or she made it home and the others did not. One of the veterans I talked to, it was his day he had one day left, and then he was flying out the next day, and he had guard duty. And his buddy knew that he needed to pack and get some things done, so he switched that duty with his friend to do the guard duty. Well, unfortunately, they were attacked, and his buddy died, and he was back getting things ready. And so he lived his whole life with the survivor's guilt that should have been him, and that his buddy died in his place. So you can imagine if that was you living with that, and how do I get the privilege of having a wife and children, and my buddy who was not supposed to have done that died in my place? That can be a lifetime that can really come to a point of discussion and something to work through. So the other thing that we want to touch on is, even for veterans who do not face combat, there's sometimes shame and feelings of failure. And like I said before, they don't even feel like they're veterans at all. So there's some issues of you'll hear it. They'll say, well, I was ready to go. I was ready to go. I was ready to serve my country, but it ended right before I went, or they never called me, but I was ready. There's some of that, and then particularly when you get in families, when brothers went and other brothers didn't, you can imagine the family dynamics there for that just guilt and shame. And that also, when we talk about, I want to touch back to that PTSD. So not everybody who has PTSD was a combat veteran. So for example, what if you were the pilot who piloted the helicopter to get people out of Korea and Vietnam, and you watched the wounded, and as they made the break for the beach to get to your helicopter, and you couldn't take them all, and you had to leave them behind? Or what if you're the guy whose job it was, you may have been on base, but it was your job was to clean out the airplane cargo area where the bodies were, and you had to wash that out and see that the trauma of what they went through? What if you're the nurse at the military hospital that has to triage who gets care and who doesn't, who gets to go first? If you have 2 or 3 veterans, or both could die, and you have to pick the one first, and then before you get to the second or third one of them dies. Imagine the lifelong decision making about that. The field medic. Maybe you're the field medic who had to come, or maybe you're the guy whose job it was to go pick up the deceased on the battlefield. So even if you weren't the one with a gun in your hand or in a tank, the military, the combat veterans are supported and surrounded by people who had to do hard jobs. You could have been the guys who had to build the bridge to get the troops over, but yet you were under attack too. So there's a lot of things. I just encourage you not to minimize the role. So if they say, well, I wasn't a combat veteran, don't just say, oh, okay. Well, ask them what they did and how they felt about that. So you might get a true story and picture of what they might be dealing with. We also know that military culture norms influence how a veteran processes end of life experiences. We know that stoicism is promoted in military, and what we mean by stoicism is they're taught and trained to not care, really, to just take whatever comes and not have strong feelings about it, to manage their feelings, suppress that down, and if it's good, okay, if it's bad, okay, we're just going to get a job and we're going to get it done. So then imagine you have that stoicism as a value within you. You've lived it lifelong, which, by the way, can impact your relationships because that's not fun to date somebody who's that stoic. But now you've been given this bad news and you're trying to process an emotion of feelings that you've never allowed yourself to have. Fear and admitting pain seen as a sign of weakness can impact their willingness to receive medical treatment at end of life. And certainly you've heard these statements, big boys don't cry, and no pain, no gain, a few good men, once Marine, always a Marine. So getting them to tell you that they're suffering and having symptoms that cause discomfort is sometimes a challenge that you really have to work to build that trusting relationship to get them to tell you. So I want to touch back to the suicide issue, and I left this slide on here even though this slide has a little bit of dated data, but it's still true that 65% of veteran suicides are over 50 and 67% a result of a firearm. Firearms because what military people are trained on how to utilize firearms. And I think you'll be hard pressed to find many military folks that don't have firearms at the ready in their home. And the one thing that is often not discussed is that we know that veterans who use VA services are less likely to commit suicide than those who don't. Here at the VA, on every appointment and every time you come in, I don't care if you're here to get your toenails trimmed, someone is going to ask you about if you feel suicidal or had any thoughts in the last 2 weeks. We're trained to try to dive into that, to try to give that veteran the opportunity to share their thoughts and feelings. And if you know in the community, for community providers, that's not necessarily integrated in service. I can tell you I've never been asked at any of my doctor's appointments if I feel suicidal. Maybe if I've been sad, but not suicidal. And nor have I ever been given resources should I happen to think that way. So we know that it makes a difference. And so that's also part of our goal is to make sure community providers are always assessing for suicidal ideation in a veteran population. We know that female suicide has increased over time and will continue to be a problem. So we have a Veterans Crisis Line. It's open to veterans, their families, their friends, the service members that are currently serving right now, and this is it. So even if you as the provider, you're on the phone and you're talking to someone and you feel like you need to get some additional suicide support, someone to talk to them that can kind of talk to them through a military experience, you can call this number and transfer the veteran to this number as well. And we give this out on a regular daily basis. And so here's the results of that. So we started this crisis line in 2007. So here's the numbers through 2018. So in that time frame, we're pushing 5 million calls from veterans who were dealing with thoughts of suicide or their family members who were concerned. More than almost 600,000 chats and 176,000 texts. And this could be just a text that this line receives that says, hey, I'm tired of living. I think I'm going to do it. And then there's a professional on that line 24/7, 365, who's reaching out to that veteran and trying to do an intervention and help them. We have made more than almost 900,000 referrals to get veterans long-term counseling and support. And 160,000 times we have sent 911 to a veteran to try to help them to do an intervention before they actually took their life. So it has been an overall, I think, important tool that we've used to try to deter veteran suicide. It's still a huge problem. And the most recent kind of statistics, it was 22 a day. We now think we're at 18 a day. So while we're talking, and today, before you lay your head down, we'll probably lose about 18 veterans to suicide today. So it's a huge problem. And we certainly want everyone to be so mindful that it's a real concern for veterans, and they mean business, and they know how to do it. I mean, they're well trained and they've seen stuff. And so using a gun does not scare them in the least, not in the least. So in addition to this PowerPoint here, these are some of the apps that our mental health providers provide to our veterans to help them. So we certainly help them create safety plans, and we talk about all those things. And then we give them some different apps that they can use to help with their stress, to monitor their PTSD symptoms, to enhance their sleep quality, just some different resources there. So let's talk about briefly here the impact on the family. And I mentioned that before. I talked a little bit about what a spouse may have to keep in mind. So we certainly know that the PTSD can affect the mental health and life satisfaction of a veteran's partner. So the same research studies on Vietnam veterans compared partners of veterans with and without PTSD. And the partners of the Vietnam veterans that had PTSD reported the following. So they reported lower levels of happiness, less satisfaction in their lives, more discouragement, demoralization, and about half felt on the verge of a nervous breakdown. So when you think about that, you've lived with a partner for a long time with a mental health problem, it can take its toll. And when all of a sudden that veteran is now diagnosed, particularly with something that may have been caused by their service time, you can imagine the feelings that you have, and also how you cope and interact with the healthcare provider. Usually, sometimes when you're dealing with a family member that has lived in this kind of circumstance, they might be a little bit demanding, and because they're used to dotting their I's and crossing their T's, they're used to running a tight ship. They're used to trying to navigate life so as not to trigger their loved one into a PTSD event. So if you have PTSD, big changes usually aren't received well. It's not received well if you show up to an appointment and the doctor was on vacation and you didn't get a call not to come. It's not received well if we scheduled you for an appointment and then we call you and cancel it for some reason. It's not received well if you were scheduled for a test and it wasn't ordered at the place, or something goes wrong, which all of those are common things that we all experience in healthcare, but can really throw veterans and their families for a loop, and causes them some really stress and anxiety. So if you're terminal and you're having to engage, you're in a powerless situation and you're having to engage more and more medical professionals that take more and more of your day and interrupt that routine that you're used to, it causes some stressful situations. So the other thing that we would recommend that you be very mindful of is spiritual distress of the military veteran, and assessing that unique spiritual needs, and including the need to receive forgiveness for war crimes or sins, and need to alleviate guilt. So you really have to look at what that person's spiritual base is, what they believe, and how they've integrated their service time into their faith. And so many times that does not come up until we're really at the end of life, when for the first time I've been with families where the wives heard for the first time, days before their loved one died, the battle story, that the things that their loved one did and the regret that they have and the concerns they have, and the need for forgiveness, the need to work out their spiritual issues. Sometimes it's really shocking to families because they didn't know, because they didn't talk about it. So always linking them to their spiritual community, whoever that is that can provide them the most support. And sometimes that's our chaplain service that's connected to VA services that's familiar, and others it's just their own church family or spiritual guidance, whatever it is that they believe. And I just encourage you to practice active listening. This is not the time for accolades, it'll be okay, or don't you worry, God understands. If they already felt that God understood, they wouldn't be in the distress that they're in. So it's really a time for good listening, getting some resources and in there to provide that support that they need to work out these things. So we're going to get into some interventions, some things, some concrete things that you're going to want to know and kind of put in your toolbox. So certainly recognize women veterans. One of the first mistakes I made here when I came into the VA lobby is I walked up to a lady and I asked her if she was waiting for her husband at his appointment. Well, she was the veteran and I looked like a moron. And she let me know it, and I appreciated the education. So making sure that we recognize all veterans, making sure that we're looking for women's veterans, look for also PTSD in women. I referred to the nurse scenario. They had big jobs, and not that they weren't on the field in combat too, particularly since the most recent wars, but we still need to look at their role and making sure we ask everyone. Don't just ask your male patients. I talk to hospices about that a lot. Just don't ask the male patients. We need to ask everybody, did they serve in service? And certainly we want to thank them for paving the way. So also consider military sexual trauma, and I have this here under women, but you need to be mindful of that for males as well. So both men and women in the military since World War II have been victims of military sexual trauma. So that can occur and raise its head, I guess. I keep using that phrase, even at end of life. Maybe nobody knew, and maybe they tell you in the last journey. They may have issues and it may impact their personal care. They may have always been a person that didn't like to be touched, and now you have a veteran in a nursing home who's going to go to a shower room. So that could be an issue. Know that care experiences, even seemingly mundane to treatment procedures, can trigger PTSD. Anticipate a possible stoic underreporting of pain. We talked about that. They're not going to tell you that they don't feel good. Be aware that veterans in addiction recovery may be reluctant to take pain medications or require higher doses. Be attentive to non-physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual, moral injuries. So we need to be asking and be attentive and be willing to listen to their story. And as I said, they may want certain environments, they may not want to be touched. And we also need to remember that many of them have witnessed death and dying on the battlefield. So their version and memory of what death looks like is maybe very different than what we experience. This person's okay. Be mindful of space. Does the veteran need to be positioned to see the door? So even if you have someone in a nursing facility or in a hospital, that may not be the person you pull the curtain on or keep the door shut. They may need to see that open space. Prepare the veteran for sudden noises and movement. This is not the person to come into and just start doing stuff to. You need to explain to them what's going on. Be prepared for a startle response. If you drop something suddenly, you accidentally drop your phone, you accidentally drop your clipboard, you can really see them jump out of their skin. Be prepared for some irritability if that happens. Try to create a calm and quiet environment. Routine, routine, routine. You will find that your caregivers will have already established a routine. We just need to honor that as best we can. I already mentioned the shower rooms. If you want to know what triggers a veteran and their PTSD, ask their wife or their partner. They'll know. He might not know, but they will, and they can tell you. Sometimes, particularly with our older veterans, we automatically assume that the behaviors that we see are dementia, or terminal restlessness, but it really could be PTSD arising. You could be seeing some agitation and irritability because all of a sudden you have, for example, a big bad Marine who's used to handling everything, and all of a sudden they're very vulnerable and they can't feed themselves and they can't turn over in the bed. That can cause a fight or flight response, which is what they're used to and what kept them alive when they were in the service. So sometimes that agitation that we're seeing isn't the dementia, it's not necessarily the delirium, and it may not respond to the medicine like you think it should because of their personal experiences. As much as possible, allow the veteran to have control of the touch. So I always tell the families, I'm going to use him, put his hand on top of yours so that he has control of the touch. So he can take his hand away if he doesn't want to. You're not holding on to him or patting his head and all of those things. Let him have control of the touch. So think about statements to avoid if you're dealing with someone that you need to respond to guilt for. It's not the time to ask, so did you kill anybody? You'll be surprised how many people ask service people that. Don't ask that. Create a safe emotional space through listening. Let them guide that conversation. Visit and listen as the patient reminisces. Just take a listening presence. They are wonderful to do a recording or video tape of their life story. Many respond well to that, to be able to feel like they have a legacy, to share what they've been through so that will not be forgotten. Memory books are also usually well received. I think Ira Byock said it best, the 4 things that matter most. Please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, and goodbye. So this is the work of the dying, no matter whether you are military or not. But specifically, when we're helping a veteran work through integrity versus despair, this is where we've got to get to. And we just may have a longer road to help a veteran get to these places. So let's talk about a little bit just about some of the services. So we certainly want to support caregivers. And in the VA, we have a plethora of services, and here are just a few. So that's the other benefit of linking a veteran to the VA is there's services here that you can't get out in the community and that are often not known about. So getting additional caregivers in the home, support and education for the caregiver to understand and what to expect, financial resources, modification of the automobile. There's all kinds of opportunities there to help. The goal of the VA is to help a veteran stay at home in the least restrictive environment as possible because that's where they want to be most of the time. So we'll do our best to do that first before we look at institutionalization and those things. So certainly here's additional services that we have: nursing home and residential settings from the VA. If home doesn't work, there are other options. There's medical foster homes, in which it kind of just works a lot like the child foster home program, in which we have trained caregivers that a veteran can go live in their home under financial arrangement with them and that caregiver. We have adult daycare, there's home-based primary care, there's a variety of services that are available. When we talk about end of life at the VA is required to provide palliative care. And palliative care is our effort to help just focus on life quality and those veterans' goals. So, and we do that outpatient and inpatient and over telehealth, whatever we need to do. So we have a life-sustaining treatment decision initiative, which is a national quality movement. So even we're trying to have conversations with veterans even before we need to. So years out, trying to get their goals and their preferences documented, so that if they have strong feelings of, I would never want to go to a nursing home, or I would never want a feeding tube, or I would never want life support, or I would, and we can get those documented on the record and have these conversations when they're not in a time of crisis. That's really the goal. Certainly, VA also provides hospice care, and that's mandated under the medical benefit for a veteran that we would provide that. We also have a We Honor Veterans program, and there might be some of our partners even on this call, in which we work with community hospices who volunteer to participate in this program so that they are familiar with veterans issues, and that as they're providing this care at the bedside, they're aware and their staff are educated and they're willing to address that and link them with us if they need to, but be well prepared to help them if they're not linked to VA. There are certainly burial resources that are available to veterans, and national cemeteries around the nation, and there's state cemeteries here, there's a state cemetery here in West Virginia as well. And this is just a number for the Survivors Assistance Office, that if you had a survivor that was really struggling and they needed to know what else they might be available for, there's this number that you can make a mental note for, and certainly call the regional office. So this is us. This is what our campus, this is a part of our campus. So VA has been here, this VA has been here since 1932. And we have what we call community-based outreach in Charleston, Gallipolis, Lenore, and Prestonsburg, Kentucky. So veterans who are all the way in Kentucky and Prestonsburg, they don't have to drive here. They can certainly go to their outreach clinic. And we see a variety, thousands of veterans as an outpatient. Let me see. So I'm not going to go into a lot about basic eligibility, because a lot of people will have questions about that, and I want to save some time for question and answer. But basically, you need to have your DD 214, and they can reach out to our eligibility, and we can walk everybody through what they need to do, because this is a very individual experience. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So it just is better to reach out, and here's a way to enroll, and they can download this form, the 1010EZ, and complete it. They can go to any VA healthcare facility. They can go online, and they can call this number, and they can begin over the phone. So there's a variety of ways that a veteran can see what they're eligible for and talk about. And here's another way: they can go on ebenefits.va.gov and begin all of this process online. I certainly know that I work with geriatric veterans, and when you talk about online, their eyes glaze over, but a lot of them have sons and daughters or granddaughters and grandsons that are very techy that can help them do that if they prefer this way, particularly in the light of COVID. So this is one of my favorite slides, and I always end with him. So this is an Army veteran who was in upstate New York in a nursing home, and he was terminal, and he was at the end of his life. And he was a World War II veteran, and it was his wish to put on this Army uniform one more time. And if any of you have worked in the healthcare field, you'll know that trying to get a veteran who's bedbound into an Army uniform would be quite the task. And it took, I'm sure, several of them, and he was certainly had a desire to be Dapper Dan that was going to be put on right. And he wanted that one more time, and you can see that they did it. And he's bedbound, and this is a part of a We Honor Veteran ceremony that our hospices do. And he was given this final salute. So even of all of the years that he lived, all of the things he experienced, it was his wish to have this uniform on him one more time. So I think it's a wonderful reminder to all of us that to honor and say thank you to our veterans and even our current service personnel. And I think about that in doing this project, and I remember my yellow ribbons. I don't have a yellow ribbon up right now. I think I might need to go get one. You know, even today, we're not hearing a lot about our troops that are deployed, and we're not having ticker tape parades, but there are, when we know that a unit is coming home, there are with the VFWs, they are going to the airports and trying to meet that unit and have some celebration. So if you're ever given the opportunity, please do so. Thank a veteran. You can tell, I think, by this presentation that how our culture treats our veterans when they come home can have a lasting impression and can make a huge difference. So with that, it's 1:42 and I'm going to shut up. So how about let's open up any questions, or was there anything in the chat box that I needed to address?
So this is Christina, and I know we stopped that recording, but I do just want to say thank you all for taking your time today to learn about veterans issues. It certainly is an emotional topic. I looked in the chat box, and many of you have had loss of your loved ones, your family has served, or you have served, and I want to thank you for your service and for the impact it's had on your family. I know that this conversation creates an emotional response no matter how you feel regarding conflicts and such, so I appreciate your attention. Does anyone have any questions from the presentation today that I can answer for you?
Hi, Christina. I was monitoring the chat and there was one very early I was hoping you could address. There was some conversation about women being hesitant to identify themselves as a veteran, and wondered if you might have insight on that.
Well, you know, it's really interesting you said that. There's last year there was a 92-year-old woman that showed up as an inpatient in our VA, and her daughters, in looking for help for her, figured out that she might be eligible, and she was a nurse. And so I think particularly back in the early wars, they were not honored as soldiers. Like they were seen as just people who had a job to do. So I think that's also an issue. And I think you also come to that, it wasn't always a positive experience, depending, you know, particularly when you look at maybe what their job was, maybe tour of duty, and depending on their culture, it was just something that you did. And if some of them felt like they weren't on the front line, they weren't making the ultimate sacrifice that some of the guys were, so they're not going to own that role. And it's often for those older veterans today, it's not till their families are looking for help that they even recognize. I remember standing at her bedside and she said, I had no idea I was eligible for all these things. So they just really never got the veteran commercial. Really, that's not ever who services have been marketed to, ever. Any other questions? Has there been an increase in suicides during the past year due to isolation? I think the number, it's certainly a concern. And I think the numbers are still not out yet. I think we have been trying to do increased outreach from a VA perspective of making that increasing awareness, increasing veterans to reach out, because it has certainly been a challenge, because even at our VA, we had to find creative ways to provide mental health for veterans who were used to coming in on a regular basis. So we did that by telehealth and video chat and text and apps and extra phone calls, and probably aggravating the dickens out of a lot of people just trying to check in over and over. I will not be surprised when all of the numbers fall out that there might not be an increase. Like, I think we've been trying to do our due diligence, but I think all of us have dealt with COVID, have struggled with that isolation in what results of that. I think the other challenge with our veterans is because many of them do self-medicate, or many of them have isolated from friends and family because of their PTSD. So if you're a normal social person, we've all felt isolated. So if you were already isolated, now you can't even go to the store. You feel even more isolated. So I think that's a big concern.
There's a question about acknowledging that our veterans are a very diverse group, and wondering what efforts have been made to provide culturally sensitive palliative care.
You know what, I think that's very important, and certainly education, but I think the best thing to do is, in what we are trying to do, is to be sensitive at the bedside. Every veteran has a unique experience and a unique family system and a unique support system. And we have to be trained to honor that, to hear from that veteran who is important to them, to engage who's important to them, and also protect them, so to speak. We want to make sure in the end of life palliative care, for example, that we have the right person as the medical power of attorney while that veteran can still tell us, because if we neglect that, for example, and they may have a significant partner that they want to be their power of attorney. If we don't assist in that, if we don't educate them in that, then it falls to next of kin, and that's certainly maybe not who they would want. So in that respect, particular special population, we're very sensitive to that, trying to have those early conversations with veterans even before they're terminal. Hey, you need to tell us who should be involved in your healthcare, and let's get the paperwork done with a medical power of attorney and advance directive, so we have the right person advocating for you in your health care. I think it's so important not to make generalities, but to really get one-on-one and take your time and develop that plan of care around the individual.
Okay, are there any other questions? We have time.
I see a comment that someone just made that their brother never referred to himself as a veteran. Mm-hmm. You know, there was somebody who went to my church and he was National Guard for 30 years, would never stand on Veterans Day, just wasn't going to do it. And I think that's the one thing that we can do as social workers, is to help inform people that they are special and that there's whatever they have done or will do in their service time is so important. And I think as a culture, we owe it to be culturally sensitive, but to show our appreciation, no matter what your personal beliefs are about anything that our U.S. government is doing, pro or con. The bottom line is there are families with sons and daughters scattered across this world, willing to do whatever they have to do in order to secure our nation and whatever that mission is. And that's quite a sacrifice. And I'm just going to tell you, I've never met a veteran who got rich from their service. Like, it's not like that we're paying them. I mean, sometimes many of our their servicemen, they're not making a lot of money as they're dragging their wife and kids across from base to base. So if you're given the opportunity to support, if you've got a family member, there's all kinds of service organizations that you can get involved to write letters, send boxes. it can make a difference. And that outreach can make a difference to a suicidal veteran as well. Just listen, just reach out and say, how are you doing? And show that you care. It can open up a magical conversation, and you might be the first to ask.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Someone shared that they wish they could get their husband in to talk to someone into the VA. And so maybe you have some advice for us on how we can help get folks who are hesitant to use the VA.
Well, that is certainly the case. I'm not going to stand here and say the VA has always had the most magical reputation. I will say, as a community provider, I can assist a veteran in a whole lot of different ways through the VA than I could when I was a social worker in the community, because there's so many special programs available to a veteran that's not available to the community. So that's one, is I would say, there are just flat out services that your best insurance can't access in the community because it doesn't exist. I'll say it that way. The second reason I would say is we're all trained to talk to veterans and to understand what they've been through and to try and engage them, for example, from a mental health perspective. And there's something that's very powerful I've seen when veterans walk in the lobby and they realize they're surrounded by people just like them, who's been through things just like them. And there's a peer group there. I mean, we've got people who come out 3 hours before their appointment just to sit around and visit in the lobby with whoever's there. So I think there's a community there that's to be had. What I would say is my recommendation to try to talk someone into it is, why don't we go give it a try? I mean, it's not like you're kidnapped if you try the VA and you don't like it. And sometimes there's a way to marry both your community service, like maybe you've got a community provider that you want to keep. There may be some services that you're still eligible for, and you're going to keep your community provider and still network and also see someone at the VA. There's different things that you can do. So I feel like you don't have anything to lose, but maybe something great to gain for sure.
Okay, there was another question that we often think of palliative care as relating to aging populations, and wondered if you could speak to any experience you have working with someone who was much younger as a vet, a Gen Z or a millennial.
Well, I will say ALS and Huntington's disease is a good example. And I will throw this out there that an ALS is a diagnosis that is service connected no matter what your service, wherever you served, whether, doesn't matter what conflict you served in. If you have ALS, that's a presumed condition. So we do have some younger veterans, and in women, we've had some breast cancer patients who have, traveled this horrific journey that they've been on. But I will say, while it's very difficult, of course, in end of life to deal with someone younger, the journey is the same, isn't it? It's all of us, no matter if you're 30 or 90, looking at your life and looking at and navigating through your regrets and what you couldn't do, what you'd like to have done, what you did, you wish you didn't do. It's helping them walk that emotional journey and integrating and coming to terms with where they are. So it is the case that we still, death is no respecter of persons or age or creed. It comes to us all we just don't know the when of it, but certainly the journey of letting go and finalizing those relationships is just a unique experience. And in service connection, those diseases, it does still happen in the VA. Like, you're right, we've talked a lot about geriatrics, but there are a lot of young veterans who are on this journey as well. How do you think? I think there was another question. I see the comments about absolutely informing young people of what happens in the military. And I think that there's some truth to that. I think that's certainly when you sit through a presentation like this and you see all of the diseases and the things that people are exposed, that doesn't make the news, does it? Very often it's not on the media. And I'm sure that every mother who had a child that was getting ready to enroll in the service have said to them, my gosh, you could have to do horrible things, and my goodness, you could die. And I will tell you, of those young, vibrant people, that doesn't deter very many of them. I think they go in with a heart and a passion that they feel called to do. But I do believe, correct, it should be an informed consent. And again, somebody today can go in the military and have a very positive experience. It changes their life. It gives them an education and it opens doors. And someone could go into that same unit and come back out with a different perception and a different experience. So it's really hard when we talk about informed consent. It's really hard to just be transparent because you don't know how that experience is going to impact someone. Anything else?
Okay, any final questions? There are lots of comments that said thank you for your time, that your compassion is evident, that this was a very important session. So I will echo that and sum it up for you, and we really appreciate you presenting last year and letting us use it this year and joining us for the Q&A.
Well, thank you. It was painful to watch myself, though, I have to tell you, but thank you guys for taking your Saturday and being with us.